Acast powers the world's best podcasts. Here's a show that we recommend.
Do you love to read or listen to books? Is your nightstand overflowing with books you just don't have time to read? Listen to my podcast, Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books with Zibby. I'm an author, publisher, podcaster, bookstore owner. My own novel, Blank, is out March 1st. And if you love books, you're in the right place. In fact, we call it the Zibbyverse, or rather, the LA Times calls it the Zibbyverse. Check us out, Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books with Zibby.
Acast helps creators launch, grow, and monetize their podcasts everywhere. Acast.com.
Remember, the 5th of November, gunpowder treason and plot. I see no reason why gunpowder treason should ever be forgot. Guy Fawkes, 'twas his intent to blow up king and parliament. 70 barrels of powder below, poor England to overthrow. By God's providence he was catched, with a dark lantern and burning match. Holla boys, let the bells ring. Holla boys, God save the king. That, my friends, was a poem celebrating the catching and overthrowing of a Catholic plot to blow up Parliament in 1605, killing all inside and King James I, because he was a Protestant king and did not believe in the Catholic Church, and crushed all Catholic religion under his foot. It was illegal to be Catholic and to practice Mass in England at that time, following on from 45 years of reign of Queen Elizabeth I, who was exactly the same. So, the reason I brought that up is I'm recording here on Halloween on the 31st of October, and a very gloomy, grey and wet day in Canberra. And in a few days' time, on the 5th of November, will be Bonfire Night, 5th of November. And we have celebrated that in the UK for 400 years, and I felt that I just wanted to talk about it because it made me think about revolution and rebellion. And those that don't know anything about or don't know the quirky British institution of Bonfire Night, what we would do is, for the weeks leading up to it, we would be hoarding old clothes and kindling and wood and scraps of rubbish. We would go and buy our fireworks, usually British made ones like penny bangers and things like that, and rockets, from the local newsagent. And we would then on Bonfire Night we would make a bonfire in the back of the garden if we had a big enough space. Kindling and rubbish, and on top of that bonfire we would put a stuffed effigy of like jeans and old jackets or whatever, stuffed with old cloths, and we would put a head of a stuffed head on, and we put a mask of, say, Guy Fawkes, on a plastic mask on. We used to use ones like Thatcher and stuff like that. I think I did a Reagan one year. And we would cook roast potatoes in the fires, and we'd have friends over, and we'd let the fireworks off safely and watch the fireworks display. Or if you didn't want to do that, you'd go to a registered fireworks display. Usually, where I grew up in North London, in Copthall, in Woods there. It was very good near the swimming pool, Copthall Stadium. And then what we would do, raggy-ass kids that we were, you think it was a sort of legal form of begging called penny for the guy, where you would stuff the guy before you burnt him. You take him usually on a wheelbarrow, or you carry him, and you put him near the train station, and you just shout penny for the guy, and people would just chuck money in your hat. It was basically registered, sort of begging. But when we used the money then, we went to use that money to buy fireworks, which we often did, to be fair. And so it made me think of rebellion and revolution. And then I thought about rock and roll and heavy metal and rock in general and music in general and revolution and rebellion. And I thought, where would we be? I know it's quite a tangent. I've gone on a tangent, but do come with me, guys. Do come with me. I thought, where would we be in music if there was no revolution and no rebellion? Would music that we know today, that we listen to today, would it have evolved that way? And I genuinely deeply thought about this, and I don't think it would have done, because the heart of rock and roll is rebellion. It starts. You can go as far back as the 10th century, even beyond there, to before at the birth of written music, when it was illegal to perform music on the streets and to act. In the UK, they would have travelling musicians and actors called mummers. That's mummers, mummers. And if they were not in every village, I think Queen Elizabeth I allowed them in certain parts of the UK, maybe London possibly, but in the provinces it was considered witchcraft, and often you could mummers would get burnt, get executed, burnt at the stake, a lot of them, for the act of witchcraft, just for making music, just by making a sound that was not a natural sound with the mouth, not just singing, but plucking rudimentary instruments or bashing rudimentary drums, because they just I think they thought it was an act against God, because the only place you should make music or be reverence to music was in church, and in the process an act of adulation of Christ. So there in itself is revolution, and just by them making that music outside. So you can go that far back, but really, if we're going to talk about the evolution of popular music, we probably need to start really. It starts with jazz, doesn't it? Really, it does start with jazz. Well, actually, it probably starts more with Baroque music, but we won't go that far back. We'll talk about. I think jazz is probably where it begins for me, because jazz was a African American music form predominantly, which is an act of revolution in itself. It's not. It's the fact that these poor, downtrodden peoples are not just revering God in church with their wonderful gospel music, but they're also making music that's sort of almost back to their tribal beginnings, where it's sexual and sensual and fun and just not. It's music again, like the mummers. It's music to elicit an emotional and a physical response that is not related to religion. And so they create this wonderful, not all jazz is impenetrable blips and blops. A lot of it, there's so many, like metal, like rock, like pop, there's so many different avenues of jazz. But if you look at the basic root of jazz, it is a wonderful time. The time signatures of jazz flow. It's just. I can't describe it. How do I describe it? I'm only just getting into jazz, guys. This is why I'm sort of saying this in a sort of stuttered way. I'm still really learning my feet around the music medium that I wish I knew more about. It is something that I am studying or beginning to listen to. So, I know people might run away and go, "Oh my God, it's jazz!" But really, if I'm going to sit here and talk about sometimes about the genesis and birth of music, and talk about music in general, you should really listen to all of it, really, shouldn't you? So I'm trying. anyway, so what I gather, it's sort of, even this sort of Haitian, voodoo's the wrong word, but this sort of sweaty, sensual vibe, in the bayous of America and in New Orleans, and then that revolution gets taken over and hijacked by, let's be honest, white New York Jews, the Jewish community take it on, because again, they're also a downtrodden and put upon community. So they look at, I think they probably look down onto, not look down as in condescendingly, but they look backwards to their African American kin and go, well, what are they doing? What have they got that gives them a sense of identity? And so musically, and so they take jazz and they take it and they make it more technical and more proficient and more, dare I say, nerdy, and then from there you roll on to, I think, the next big revolution from there is blues. And I think the reason that blues is a revolution that still rolls along today, I did an episode a few months back called Where'd the Blues Gone, Man? Because I still believe that the heart of all rock and roll and all heavy rock and heavy metal, all modern rock, and to be honest, all modern music is blues, because all our musical scales are generally based around a blues scale, most of the time, or bastardizations of it therein. But so you got the blues. You have the blues. The blues comes along, and it's the everyman music. Whereas jazz went from being the everyman music to a really complicated art form that sort of nerdy, thick-rimmed glasses, guys with thick-rimmed glasses and light brown corduroys and plastic slip-on shoes would do, smoking a pipe, sitting there in a big windback chair, trying to, with their glass of brandy, pretending that it's something that it's not. That's what they're doing. That's what they did. They took it away almost. And I think the thing with blues is the same. So bluesing, we move the downtrodden of the world into a different era. So again, the African Americans of this of the 20s and 30s now have a little bit more freedom, because it's now post. Well, I say freedom loosely. You have you have the emancipation, and so they have more movement and freedom in some states, and they want again another identity, and way to express yourself or your identity. The best way to do it is through an art form medium, either written word, either the music, painting, drawing, cinema. Expression is easy. It's easy for human beings to express themselves through an artistic medium, and I think what they were doing is what we got with blues is we now have a more sophisticated, yet simple version of jazz, if you know what I'm coming from there, right? So they're taking, they're I think, and again, I could be wrong, there are probably people who've done really big studies into this, but the way I look at it is that the black Americans, and so I don't use the term black, I like to say African American, but it's not, when I say black, I mean that not in a I am white and you're black sense, but in a sense of their heritage. So African Americans or black Americans, they wanted as we moved into the 20th century, they wanted more. They got more, so they were holding down jobs what they could. They had a bit of expendable money. They could buy a guitar, They had families and relationships and built lives. This is post-emancipation, I meant to say, okay? But the trouble with that is that being such how it says, without being such a sad time in the history of their community, still, the glimmer on the horizon that they could say and have what they would say and do what they want in certain parts of their country, but on the same hand, completely controlled and segregated. There's no law of slavery anymore. They are free men and women and children, but they are really not free men, women and children. They are not enslaved to one person, but they're enslaved to their colour and their background and their socio-economic background. So when these great bluesmen, and there were amazing great bluesmen, like my favourite is Albert King, but Muddy Waters and Buddy Guy and all those great John Lee Hooker, all the great bluesmen, when they were writing their music, they found a musical form that wasn't jazz. It was a bit more, as I said, it was certainly different, simpler to jazz, but they found within the 12 bars, and we call it now 12 bar blues, but within the 12 bars, they found a way of expressing their sadness. Because again, as I said before, the way to express yourself through art is, do you really want to lie and say, oh, it's sunshine and happiness, when really, the best thing to write about is the truth. What you've done, what is your truth, is the easiest thing to write about. What is truth to you and experience to you. So these people were writing songs that were sad, and that's the reason why it's called the blues. That's it, really, isn't it? A lot of the stuff is quite sad, because it's experiences of them, lost love, segregation, violence, death, poverty, and there lies that revolution. Because in that revolution and that rebellion, by saying, I'm not just going to go to work in the factory, make you millions making rubber sole shoes, go home and do the same thing mindlessly day after day. I'm going to go home, I'm going to go and sit on my very meek and mild porch where, avoiding being hung up by the KKK, avoiding racial violence from my neighbours. I'm going to write, I'm going to play this guitar, and all my friends around me are going to listen to me play, and I'm going to entertain my family and with my stories of woe, and they're going to do the same thing, and we're all going to be universally unhappy, but in the same time joyous, because we are setting free our worries. We set them free. As soon as they sing about their sadness, it's letting go of it. It's like why people go to church and confess, or why they go to church and pray. It's to let go of it, be free of it, to start another day in the same thing. Now, you might say, Tony, where's the revolution in that? Well, the revolution is sonically. So from jazz's, overly complicated chord structures that was taken away from its roots and complicated by white middle class or white Americans, to back to the African Americans again, to revolutionize it, to make this almost complex music in simple structures. That itself alone is revolution, or evolution, or rebellion, in fact, because it's rebelling against. I'm not just going to go and go to church and sing gospel. I don't have the ability to now play the jazz that all these guys are now playing, because no one will come and listen. But I can make this amazing 12-bar simple music that is in its same complicated. If it might be the BB King box where it's just all played, 6 notes in a box. It could be the Albert King solos all on one string. It could be the Buddy Guy's, he plays all up in E. They're simple, but they're complicated, and that's the reason why Jeff Beck and Eric Clapton and Gary Moore and I could name so many white blues guitarists from the UK drew to their music because it was complicated and simple at the same time. It's a delicious mix. That's why I think it's at the best of all rock and roll now. So there's the evolution, I think, and rebellion there. Rebelling against the poverty. Because, a lot of the blues stuff is now the 30s. So you've got coming out of the 20s with its depression, into 30s with the war, fighting for their country that they weren't thankful for doing. They weren't thanked. They were sent there and they were just fodder. And honestly, they were just, we know the stories. I'm not going into make it a political podcast, but you understand what I'm saying. And so there's the first part of evolution and revolution in pop music. You've got your jazz, then you've got your blues, and again, blues is again like jazz. You've got my favorite, which is bluegrass blues, which is a very much sort of a skiffly sound, and very slightly but played in a slightly different key to traditional blues. It's not the typical, it's not that kind of, status quo, another song, another song. It's not that kind of blues. It's a little bit more. Go once you listen to this podcast and you stop, go and listen to some. You can get on YouTube, just YouTube bluegrass blues, and see what you think. Gary Moore was a big proponent. He loved bluegrass blues, and so it was one of his favourites. And Texas blues as well, which was faster and more aggressive, which is, I think, where most heavy rock comes from, the Texas blues aspect side of it. So there you go, starting off with a bit of, not just playing music in church, and then not just playing music for yourself, but for other people, and then being able to afford guitars and be able to have a voice and be able to join in together. There's your revolution, right? And honestly, to me, I think that's probably, out of all the musical revolutions that we'll talk about after this, I think they're the most important of the lot, because the genesis and the DNA of all the music you're listening to now, even if it's some awful EDMA, whatever it is, beats thing, somewhere down there, deep in its, atoms, right inside its chromosomes, right deep down in its spark of life, is the blues. And so we have to say thank you for that, and we have to say thank you for the evolution from jazz to blues. And so it goes to say, right now I'm going to go and freshen my tea, and then when I come back on the other side, we'll talk about everything from the blues onwards. Now, as I said, I've not got this, historically accurate. Well, guys, don't go telling me I'm going, oh, you didn't get the dates, I did blah 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 blah. No, this is just an anecdotal chat about how I feel. It's an emotional chat. I think, yes, jazz, then blues. And of course, jazz hasn't gone away. Jazz is still there, but jazz isn't as influential as blues would be, as I said, because it's been train spotted. It's been anoraked to a point where it's sort of almost anoraked itself out of the musical lexicon, sadly. Anyway, I'm going to go now and get my fresh tea. I'll talk to you on the other side, guys. Bye for now. Welcome back, guys, to the second part of the show, where we're talking about evolution and revolution revolution and rebellion in rock and roll. Now, I sort of quickly skated over the sort of the birth of, and I probably missed lots and annoy people, but jazz and then blues. Where do we go from there? Well, of course, the next revolution, the one that changes all, and the reason I'm sitting here doing my podcast and talking about this, and when you're listening to this podcast, is rock and roll. Rock and roll, people. It is what it is. So, 1950s America. Okay, so in fact, not even 50s, it'll be the 40s, mid-40s in America, is when it will happen. I keep thinking it's the 50s, but that's more the UK. But yes, no, mid-40s. Okay, rock and roll emerged as a defined musical style in the United States in the early to mid-50s. It derived most directly from the rhythm and blues music of the 1940s, which itself developed from earlier blues, the beat-heavy jump blues, boogie-woogie, up-tempo jazz, and swing music. So, again, rock and roll music comes solely from an evolution, or a revolution within blues. Okay, so we as human beings have taken this art form, the blues, which was quite, musically drab and dark and sad, because that's lyrically, because that's the truth of the people making the music. But then the musicians of the 40s, they wanted to make, they listened to the chord structures and the chord progressions and the palette of colours and that they had to play with, and went, well, hang on, why don't we make this? We use this wonderful 12 bars and speed it up and add some, brass and make it a bit more fun, and we can take it to the, we can dance to this. We can do something within this 12 bar structure, and they make, as I said, swing and boogie woogie and big band. And that, therefore, is a next revolution, because and of course, from then into rock and roll, of course, with Elvis and Little Richard and Jerry Lee Lewis, and who passed away recently. In fact, yesterday, before I recorded this program, and Little Richard, if I didn't mention him before, so you've got to think that coming out of the war, whereas the UK and Europe was bomb-ridden, damaged, it was a pockmarked face of the world. It was devastated, economically, emotionally, spiritually, physically, just absolutely depleted after 5 years of war. But on the other side of the Atlantic, the Americans, even though, yes, of course, they lost a lot of men in the war, but they came late into it, and they were never really harmed apart from Pearl Harbor. So their country's in prosperity. They've lent lots of money to Europe in war reparations, and so in loans, and then they're paying them back. They're doing very, very well. They have lots of manufacture. They have the first teenagers. So we first come across the concept of teenagers in the 50s, late 40s and early 50s. Whereas before, you went to school, you left school, you were a man, you were a woman, that went into the workforce, you had children. There was no liminal state between youth and adult. It was just so. And now this whole category of 13 to 18 suddenly was created. Now, what do you do in that space when you have that space? You need to fill it, and of course, people want to make money, and to make money, you have to exploit things sometimes, and to exploit that is what they did. So, revolution-wise, they created a music that was aimed solely at the teenagers. Now they had part-time jobs, they had pocket money, they had money burning in their pockets, and who wants that money? The big corporations want that money. What bigger at the moment? What makes a teenager then, more so then than now? What really drove a teenager? What drove teenagers was sex. Now, it drives all teenagers now, but sex drove them then. And the only way they could really connect with the opposite sex safely and with their parents' conception, letting their parents do it, not letting the parents allow them. God, I couldn't think of the word let their parents do it. Oh man, Freudian slips. Approval is the word I'm thinking of. Was to have the hops, which were, not what you put in your beer, but what is, like a dance, a school hall dance. And what music's going to make them move? Well, you can't make teenagers move around and gyrate and dance to classical music. You can't do it to jazz because it's too complicated and also seen as black people's music and so forth, not really allowed. Same with blues, again, being African American. These, some of these white families were not allowed the children, still in some segregation still, okay? I mean, we have still segregation here in the cities, so they couldn't dance to that music. So what happens is people like Elvis Presley and Little Richard, and they hear, growing up listening to the blues, because Elvis grew up in a house in a poor neighborhood, and listened to a lot of jazz, and mixed with a lot of African Americans listening to jazz and blues. And then, like anything, like any seed of revolution, something changes. Something they hear something and go, I can do something else with this, and I can take this elsewhere. And overnight, almost, with the Sun Records, Elvis's Sun Records, he suddenly made. That's why, because I'm not an Elvis fan, okay? I understand his historical significance, and I understand more and more as I get older how important he is. Musically, not much for me, because I grew up in the house, and my dad loved Buddy Holly, and my mother loved Elvis, and there was lots of arguments in the house over it. And my dad used to always win, and therefore we just listened to Buddy Holly. But that, again, same part of the rock and roll movement. So along comes rock and roll, and it becomes exciting, right? And you got Chuck Berry, throwing his shapes all over the stage, playing these outrageously fast, then and interesting bastardizations of blues solos to a faster, skippier beat. And now, for the first time, the bass is coming heavy into the lineup. And suddenly you've got this more dynamic, sexualized aggression post-war that the more older members of the community were very scared of. I mean, there's a reason why they only shot Elvis from the waist up, because his gyrating hips, according to the British censors, would inflame women and girls. And of course it did. Because you imagine the revolution there. You're sitting there. Your life is planned out ahead of you. You're going to go to school. You're not going to learn much as a female. Sadly, you're going to be taught how to cook, clean, respect your elders, be religious, and look after your husband. And I'm not condoning that. It's just what it was then. And suddenly, you're 13 years old, you turn the TV on, and there in a little black and white image on a soundstage in New York or in LA or wherever he was, is Elvis doing Jailhouse Rock. It's infectious. It's joyful. It's movement. It's just, all of a sudden there would be I hate this term, there's a burning in your loins, right? There's a fire in your belly, and you want to go out and you want to dance those dances. So so for that moment, for that little period, there's your revolution there. From blues, big band and swing to rock and roll. and of course it went across the UK, into the UK and in Europe. And in the UK we had Bill Haley and the Comets, or Rock Around the Clock. We had our own version of, which was called skiffle. Now skiffle was like rock and roll, but and blues mixed, but they were sort of made instruments. You'd have a box with a broom handle and a string on it, and you'd make a double bass out of it. There's a very, very good book by Billy Bragg about the history of skiffle in the UK. I highly recommend it. Anyway, that aside, it takes over the world. Rock and roll, skiffle, rock, it then becomes just rock and roll, becomes rock. And so it gets quashed again, doesn't it? It gets pushed into a box and squeezed down, and they have hops, and you have places where the music can be played, but it's sanitized and clean. So again, the revolution is there for a short period, but it's still there, it's still burning, because what it's done is it's unleashed the demons inside the 12 bars of blues and the craziness of jazz, and it has opened up a whole new Pandora's box of goodies, right? There's a reason why it says the devil has the best tunes, yeah? And that rock and roll music creeps across the Atlantic, okay, and ends up in the hands of people that will become, they would trade their records. The Beatles were a good example. Because they were in the port of Liverpool, where the records were coming in off the boats from sailors, they would trade for money or goods for these singles, which were rare, and then they would play them and learn to play them, and that's where that sound evolves, particularly through Europe and in the UK, and that's how the UK rock scene starts to grow. And that's why the early form of, before you had rock and roll, but then the next revolution was in the UK was blues refound. So we as a nation, well, I say we, the Brits as a nation, discovered the blues again, because again it was hidden. It was an American thing. We wouldn't know much about it because it comes through onto the boats and through the immigrants coming into the UK. Suddenly we had blues, and so then there was a big blues explosion. That's not really so much a revolution, but it does tie in with the rock and roll revolution there. But then then rock and roll dominated the airways for 10, 15 years, from the 50s into the 60s. All forms of rock and roll, okay? You have your blues breakers, you have Cream, you have the Beatles, you have the Who, you have mod bands, blues. I mean, the Who were a blues band, Black Sabbath were a blues band, and so that's where they started. They were playing there before it then evolved and revolved again. And firstly, and I'm going to say this because I cannot stand this form of music, I'm not a big fan of it, but this is what I'm about to talk to you about in a minute. But this is this is the next phase of evolution, of rebellion in rock and roll. So you have our rock and roll, but it becomes, after 10 years, it becomes normal. The kids that were listening to it when they were 13 and now 23, adults are having children of their own. It's not a shock anymore. But then we have we have war. Because the world is always full of war. It's a sad fact of life, but there is conflict everywhere in the world. And then we have Vietnam. Okay, we have Vietnam, that the war that should never really have been fought, but was. Hippies is what I was trying to come to. Ignore my war statement there. I'm not trying to be political. It's just that, it is what it is. Hippies. Now, why is the hippie revolution important? The next important step from rock and roll. It is important for one or two things, or three things actually. LSD. Okay, drugs, baby, drugs, you know. Yeah, that kind of thing. I've got the munchies, all that kind of stuff. Now, there were always drugs in music, okay? Quite well known that a lot of jazz men would take in opium, blues guys were drinking, smoking weed. Yeah, they were doing that. But the hippie movement, I myself find it hard to associate with hippies as a hippie movement thing, because it's a musical revolution and a youth movement that basically did nothing. That aside, I love prog rock, and a lot of prog rock is quite hippie, so contradictory as I am, that's human beings, we can contradict ourselves. It's fine. What I don't believe in is that you can change the world musically and politically by all sitting in a field taking drugs to the point where you couldn't move. As I said before, you know, people take drugs now and they take LSD and they go out to a party. My brother would take LSD and he was the chair. Okay, he couldn't leave the chair. He was the chair. I've said it before and I've said it again, exactly what it was. I don't believe that it did anything. That aside, it's a revolution. It's a rebellion. It's, again, youth, teenagers. Now, the teenagers of the 60s are more informed and intelligent than the teenagers of the 50s. No longer, we are now giving the vote to everyone, and there are women's rights, and there are black rights, and the world is changing. We have sexual revolution, because now women can be in control of their birth control, which means they can then control their sexual partners. And there's a revolution, and in that revolution, those children, those teenagers, they want to make music that expresses themselves and their movement and their religion and their beliefs. And so they make, and you know, the Beatles, they transformed into a hippie band with Sgt. Pepper and beyond, with like John Lennon and Yoko Ono and the Plastic Ono Band. And of course, you know, a lot of those 60s flower power bands. But inside the only downside to that aspect is that there was no musical revolution inside the hippie movement. I think the only true, I mean, you can say Pet Sounds and you can say Sgt. Pepper all you want to me, and yes, they are musically they are musically diverse and very, very strong view that they change the way of modern music. I'm going to sort of side note that in a second. Yes, they did, but they were in their late 20s, early 30s. These were not children. This isn't a youth movement revolution in their music. Musically, yes, but they'd already been playing for such a long time before then that the music they were making was really by accident, probably, and by the use of drugs and the technology growth of the 60s, putting the man on the moon and so on. They grew themselves musically with the equipment they could use, which opened up their minds, which they used the drugs to open up their minds even further. So I think more revolution musically wise, to be honest, if you're talking about psychedelia, the greatest psychedelic album is Disraeli Gears by Cream. Now you might shout around your speaker at me and say, but it's just a blues album. Yes, it is. But Ulysses, the Tale of Ulysses, is, just put that on, all right? Tales of Brave Ulysses, the third track on side 2. Album was released in 1967. My personal belief is that's where the hippie musical movement and revolution coalesced. Yes, you also have Eric Clapton. This cannot be denied. Jimi Hendrix. But again, Jimi Hendrix, and I'm going to really annoy people here, to a point, is just a really fucked off his face bluesman. Yes, I mean, he did some crazy revolutionary sounds and some crazy amazing things, but again, it's all driven by what he put in himself. And so the hippie movement. So where am I? I'm sidetracking. So the hippie movement. So what they do, they introduce mind-altering chemicals into the youth, the more intelligent youth society and movements, creating more interesting and revolutionary music with hippie, with like flower power music, and then into prog. This is another thing. So we go from the hippies of the 60s doing not much in their movement, but revolutionizing the way that we open our mind to music. And by opening our mind, by those bands expanding their minds with chemicals, I'm not condoning it, that's what they did, they tapped into more wild and crazy jazz-based musical nodes and blues stuff that, they're then children of the revolution. Thank you, any T-Rex fans out there. Then children of the revolution. So the kids sort of too young to take drugs in the 60s, who were then sort of moving into adulthood and teenage years and adulthood in sort of the late 60s and early 70s. They were then growing up listening to music that was more intricate and thick and diverse and more prog. Hence, the next musical revolution is prog. It's the progressive rock movement. Now, again, you're going to probably roll your eyes and go, "I knew we'd get to prog somewhere." No, all roads lead to prog. It's like my wife and I have this theory. If you watch one of those MTV top 10 records of, top 10 rock songs and top 10 rock lyrics and top 10 rock videos, all leads to Queen. I dare you try the experiment. It all leads to Queen. Always number one, somewhere or two, is Queen. Anyway, that aside. So, the musical revolution of prog. Why is it revolution? Why is it evolution? Rebellion? It's more evolution that... Sorry, I keep saying evolution. Wrong word in my head. It's more a rebellion, or... as I said, because they are moving away from the simplicity of some of the pop music made of the 60s. There was a lot of simplicity because we went from complexity to simplicity, and the revolution there is that they took complexity and brought it back. But what they did is they, instead of giving it back to the common man, they kept it for themselves and made it a like Monty Python. People consider Monty Python. There was a crowd, wasn't there? It was the Monty Python crowd or the Goodies crowd, right? And the Monty Python crowd is usually more intelligent, more educated, university types. And I think this is what happened with the revolution for prog, because they took the simplicity of pop music, didn't want it anymore. They wanted the accessibility of the simplicity of rock and roll, but they wanted to go and move into complex. Oh, there's my phone going. Ignore that. 1 second. Seamless edit. I'm back with us now. They wanted to see it. They wanted the simplicity and of pop. They wanted the complexity of classical music and jazz and R&B, and they want to take a bit of everything. Now, it is solely where all these other revolutions I'm talking about are, to some extent, mainly global. Apart from some early blues and jazz, after that, rock and roll is a global phenomena. Prog rock is more a British phenomena. I had this discussion with John the other day. Yes, it's about breaking out from your musical shackles, but at the same time it's also a very British thing, because it's very It's very pastoral. It's very whimsical. It's very British, like Python, as I said. But the reason that that prog is a revolution is because they then unshackled rock and roll and gave it a bit more width instead of just being 1, 2, 3, 4. It opened up the vista for you and the field of which to play in. But unfortunately, what they did, like all revolutions, they tend to fail. Hippies fail because you can only take so many drugs, and sitting in a field picking flowers doesn't change anything. Same with the progressive rock. It gets such to a point where you end up reversing straight up your own fundament, and no one will listen, and you just become a footnote in history. Now, there are many prog bands out there that I can name that you would know. There are hundreds and hundreds of others that you wouldn't. And the ones you know are the ones you know because they tend to straddle the fine line of rock and roll pop music. Genesis, Pink Floyd, even though I don't think Pink Floyd are prog. I'm doing this with air quotations. Sorry, John, I know it makes your eyes roll. Pink Floyd, Genesis, yes, so on. Now, that revolution, I cannot get my head around it. That revolution petered out as a 3 or 4 year window, and it was very much a British thing, didn't go anywhere to some extent. It did create lots of other bands. I'm not saying, when I say this revolution didn't go anywhere, these revolutions didn't go anywhere, I don't mean they failed, because we still listen to their music now, and other bands still play in those forms of music. There's no failing, it's just they didn't. If you were having an agenda, you would write it down like a party political broadcast. It didn't do what they said they were going to do. It didn't do what it said on the packet, let's just be honest. Prog is coming back now because people, again, are searching for something new that they don't realise is new, is old, because it's been buried away. So again, we have stadiums sold out. We have multi-million-dollar ELP or Emerson, Lake and Palmer tours. We get Wembley Stadium filled out, and then playing Fanfare to the Common Man. This 15-minute, Moog-driven masterpiece. So people were buying it, people were listening to it, but it was limited, and the people that were buying it were then getting older, because it was the university types were buying it, and then going off and getting married, having kids, and putting music on the back burner. So the youth movement had nowhere to go. Where was its revolution? Where was its rebellion? So, bang, crash, wallop, the greatest of all the musical revolutions, punk, happened. 76, 77. Now, of course, it happened simultaneously across the two continents, Europe and America. The American punk movement, where the name means a different thing, is more art house, more, almost, dare I say it, proggy music in the New York scene. Very much the one small 8-block area around the CBGBs. Your Blondie, your Talking Heads, Television, the Ramones, these bands. They were making this sort of art house, sort of eccentric, almost disco-driven music. Like there was a sort of an almost disco-esque theme to some of it, and making the music again with things like bands like New York Dolls, who were sort of glam. I'm not using. Oh, by the way, also I'm not putting glam as a revolution, because glam, I want something that if I put every musical revolution in this, we'd be here all day. So I'm sort of skipping some, and glam. So those that go, what about glam? Forget it for the moment, okay? Park it elsewhere. So in the UK, Now in America, so as I said right at the beginning of the show, they've come out of Vietnam. There is still unhappiness. You've got assassinations of presidents. You've got economic crashes. You've got socioeconomic unrest with Black Panther movements and all that sort of stuff going on. But really, the most people on the street in most cities were well fed. They had good cars, good houses, good jobs, good education. Across the ocean, though, back in London, we are still fighting post-war. There were still bomb sites. I grew up walking around areas that were still bomb sites. I remember as a young boy in the East End of London, my grandfather, there were still bomb sites. There was the 3-day week, 1973, where you could only work for 3 days. So they cut because the miners were on strike. So they cut all the power after those 3 days. No TV, no lighting, no nothing. Your dad only worked for 3 days, so if you only got 3 days pay, and at that time there was only usually one breadwinner in the house. So therefore we were, everyone, there weren't handouts from the government. You had to survive on those 3 days' wages. I remember eating, as a young boy, listening to the radio that was battery powered under candlelights. One of my earliest memories. There was shit in the streets. There was piles of rubbish in the streets. It was drab. It was brown or avocado green. It was wet all the time. It was just horrendous. It was just absolute high unemployment, high inflation. We were still paying our loans back to countries, after the war. We had men and women that were, raising their children, their grandchildren, who were war victims and veterans and so on. And so when John Lydon, Steve Jones, and Paul Cook and Glenn Matlock form a band in a revolutionary, sent around a revolutionary clothing store called Sex in West London, in Chelsea. When Vivienne Westwood makes defamatory and aggressive political statements to shock and to create and evoke a powerful emotion, and they make an album that completely changes the music industry completely. Now, the punk movement in America, had the English punk movement never happened, nothing would have happened. It would have just been a footnote in history. The only band I truly believe that would have done anything was the Ramones, because they were truly different, but it would have done nothing. It would have just gone quiet. Whereas the UK's punk movement, because they had seen the Ramones and they wanted the speed, the power, the amphetamine drive of punk, the American punk, that particular part of American punk, and they took it to and they played it with their simple music, their simple love of rock and roll. Yes, drug fueled, of course it was. Like most youth movements, there was a drug element, but most of it was self-contained, to be honest. So they take this and they make it political. The Americans would never do it, make a political statement. They're at that point far too scared, far too white middle class. Sorry, Americans, if you're listening to this, I'm not offending, not being offensive to your nation or you as a people, but it's just a time frame. So overnight, I'm not going to go through the whole punk movement, but overnight, musically, they went, we don't want these 18-minute bloated orchestral pieces. We want rock and roll again. We want the power and the fun and the speed and the energy of Elvis, but we want it our way, and we want it harder and faster and more aggressive, louder and louder and louder, and more political. Now, not all punk bands of the 70s were political. In fact, they weren't. I think there was only a handful, really. I mean, the Clash and the Pistols, but most of the time it was bands just wanted to make fun rock and roll fuzz tone guitars, anyone can do it, and there's a revolution. That's why it's the most emphatically the most important revolution in music, because anyone can do it. That was their ethos, DIY music. Now, purists might go there and say, oh, but it's noise they make. Yeah, it's noise, but without them making noise, silence, and with silence, no music. It can't always be carried on the shoulders of people that are musically literate to the point of madness. It has to be the fire of rock and roll. Elvis couldn't play only 3 chords, and that's all he needed. And it's the same with the punk. It's 3 chords, and that revolution that petered out very quickly. And the reason that revolution petered out quickly was because drugs again. Okay, it came along and it destroyed heroin now, which is more pernicious and more destructive. And it also, when you burn that bright and that fast, it can only burn to a certain degree. And to me, when Sid died, the revolution died. Full stop. Because he was, for me, the heart of the revolution. Now, what the revolution is important because it echoes and still echo now. You don't get echo. You get very fine echo ripples of punk, of prog. You get fine echo ripples of the hippie movement. You get very fine echo ripples in the water of music of jazz and blues. But the punk stuff is still there because they didn't need a record label. They didn't need to go to some corporate idiot to say, yes, I can sell that as a record. They could do it themselves, and that's why it's important, because overnight people who had a want and an ability created some fantastic music. Yes, they made some mess, but they made some fantastic music that's still played today, that still pushes forward. And why it's important as well is because even though us long-haired nutters who love our heavy metal, I love my punk, but love our heavy metal, will say to you, well, where do we fit in? We fit in because of punk. Because without punk, I know that your Black Sabbaths and your Deep Purples are bluesmen, and so they're only heavy rock. Okay, that sits above your rock and roll as a subgenre. Then you have your heavy metal peers, because again, teenagers that are growing up, that are too young for punk but now a bit older, once the punk is starting to burn out, they want something themselves. They want the fire and the passion and the aggression of punk, but they also want the storytelling and technicality of prog. So they combine, but they want the wall of sound of heavy rock, and it combines to make the next musical revolution, which is heavy metal. Now, heavy metal is still an ongoing revolution and rebellion, because even so, not so much now like the 80s where it would have, people were offended, they were burning records and the satanic panic, and no, it doesn't really care anymore. It doesn't really make waves anymore. That's not due to the music form, that's due to the way we consume music, and the way that music is no longer a cultural phenomenon that's important to teenagers, as it was to us old folk. So the heavy metal phenomena and the revolution, and that revolution there is still ongoing, because it's a time we still live in this revolution, because inside our world of heavy metal there are more internal revolutions and rebellions, pushing aside the technicality of the 80s where if you didn't have a million notes in a bar and you couldn't play as fast as a speed of light, you weren't really heavy. That now is sort of moving aside, and there's more crunching A chords and aggression. You had that whole New York American LA hair metal scene, which I can't stand. Where it's all where they grab. And I was talking about parking the glam. Take the glam back out off the shelf. There it is. That's their revolutionary focal point. Every revolution has a focal point, and heavy metal revolution was glam. The androgyny of glam. Is it a man? Is it a woman? The David Bowie story, right? And then you have some of the harder, faster, aggressive metal stuff points directly to punk, and to, in fact, not so much the first wave of punk, but the second wave in the 80s. So you're Exploited and Extreme Noise Terror, all that sort of oi sound, without the skinhead aggression. They were grabbing that. You then want to be rebellious again within the heavy metal scene, and you go to the church burning, satanic, black underground metal that's impenetrable in some places but beautiful in others, and that's another revolution that's ongoing within our own musical realm that we listen to. So ours, I consider, or metal as a revolution, as a rebellion, is still going on, because it's still relevant, even from, and I consider the birth of heavy metal for me is the new wave of British heavy metal. So 81 onwards, that post-punk British metal sound, and I think that sound is still going on. We're still doing it, still evolving it, and still revolving it. Are there other musical revolutions? Yes, there are, since then and ongoing. I'm not going to go over them, but we can discuss them because I'm getting over the hour mark now. But you have disco in the 70s, which I completely missed. There's a revolution, right? Okay, and again, that's about fun, freedom, sex and drugs. A bit like an amped up version of the Hippies. Died off because there's only so much within that musical subgenre, that musical genre can do. It doesn't have anywhere to expand, and I think that's how revolutions evolve, because they need a point of expansion. And I think metal is continuously expanding. Rock and roll only expanded a certain far. Blues could only go a certain way. Prog could only really go a certain way because of its own fundament. Its own fundamental points. Although you get neo-prog movements and so on. But anyway, that's not a revolution or rebellion. Although it sort of is, because it's pushing against modern pop music. So it is a sort of a semi-rebellion. And then you've got your electronic music of the late 80s and early 90s, or your keyboard-driven stuff, or your Ahas and Whams and, Human Leagues and so on and so forth. Tubeway Army, all that sort of... That was a revolution and evolution and rebellion, because that was saying, I don't need guitars. We don't need your guitar. We don't need 6 strings and chords and hours and hours and hours and hours and hours of practice. I can get this box. I can play a rudimentary chord pattern, hit a button, and fill it with all these wonderful sounds I can create music with. So there is a revolution. That itself is still ongoing as well, because that now has moved on to your EDMs and your pop music that's now made in the bedrooms. But that also harks back to the revolution of punk, because without punk, people wouldn't be making music in their bedrooms and their houses. I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you in this microphone gibberish, would I? Because it just wouldn't happen because of that revolution. So there are ongoing revolutions still, but the one that's for me that's ongoing the most is still heavy metal, because it all still has so much more to give. Anyway, that's me rabbiting on. I've gone way too long, but that's okay. I'm sure you don't mind listening to my lovely mellifluous voice. Let me have some tea. 1 second. I hope you've enjoyed it. I really enjoyed thinking about revolution and evolution and rebellion. I had to put evolution in there because I kept saying it. Oh, God, it's such a similar word. You sit here and try and not say evolution when you're meant to say revolution. Anyway, I am about to go now and get a nice fresh drink. And I will see you next week. Hopefully, it's not so wet and my phone doesn't go off and I don't go off on a tangent. Well, I probably will. That's why you come here, isn't it? Anyway, talk to you soon, guys. Have a spooky Halloween. I hope you've had a spooky Halloween. I hope you've had a really good, if you're in the UK, a bonfires night, and you've kept safe and you've lit the blue touch paper and stood well back. Please, if you don't know what that means, Google it or ask one of your English mates. Anyway, bye for now.
Acast powers the world's best podcasts. Here's a show that we recommend.
Do you love to read or listen to books? Is your nightstand overflowing with books you just don't have time to read? Listen to my podcast, Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books with Zibby. I'm an author, publisher, podcaster, bookstore owner. My own novel, Blank, is out March 1st. And if you love books, you're in the right place. In fact, we call it the Zibbyverse, or rather, the LA Times calls it the Zibbyverse. Check us out, Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books with Zibby.
Acast helps creators launch, grow, and monetize their podcasts everywhere. Acast.com.